There is a moment that separates two types of people permanently, not a moment of triumph, not a moment of inspiration, a moment of failure, real and unexpected, where everything that was supposed to work simply stops working. In that exact moment, some people freeze. Their thoughts collapse inward. Their decision-making slows down as if the brain itself is running out of oxygen. And the problem in front of them, which may have started small, begins to expand in their mind until it becomes something much larger than it actually is. They are not weak. They are not incompetent. They simply were never taught what to do when complexity and pressure arrive at the same time. NASA engineers face that moment regularly, not as an exception, as a condition of the work. When something goes wrong at 400 kilometers above the Earth, there is no option to pause, no option to consult a manual at a comfortable pace, no option to wait until the pressure passes. The environment demands a cognitive response that most people spend their entire lives never developing. And here is the part that changes everything. The way those engineers think under pressure is not a personality trait. It is not natural talent. It is a trained mental architecture, a system, a set of specific cognitive habits that were deliberately constructed over time and that, when activated, allow the brain to operate with precision exactly when everything else would normally cause it to collapse. This is not about stress management. This is not about breathing exercises or staying calm. This is about how a trained mind processes information differently when the stakes are at their highest. And once you understand the architecture behind it, you will not think about pressure the same way again. The first thing to understand is that the common approach to pressure is neurologically wrong. When most people feel the weight of a high-stakes situation, their instinct is to think harder, to push more cognitive effort into the problem, to increase the mental intensity. It feels like the right move. It feels productive. But what actually happens inside the brain during this process is almost the opposite of useful. The prefrontal cortex, which is the region responsible for logical analysis, planning, and nuanced decision-making, begins to compete for resources with the limbic system, which is the region that generates the stress response. The more emotional intensity builds, the more the prefrontal cortex is starved of the resources it needs to function at full capacity. Thinking harder under pressure without a specific cognitive method does not produce better thinking, it produces louder thinking. And loud thinking in a complex situation is one of the most dangerous states a person can be in. NASA engineers are trained to do something that feels counterintuitive at first. Before they attempt to solve anything, they perform what the cognitive literature describes as a rapid problem decomposition, but what the engineers themselves often describe simply as getting honest about what you actually know. In the middle of a crisis, the brain has a tendency to merge what is confirmed with what is assumed. Real information and hypothetical information begin to blend together, and the person believes they are working with facts when they are actually working with a mixture of data and anxiety-driven projection. The first cognitive move of a trained mind is to create a hard separation between those two things. What do I know for certain right now? What am I inferring? What am I assuming without evidence? That separation alone recalibrates the entire thought process because suddenly the problem is smaller than it appeared. The actual confirmed problem is always smaller than the emotional version of the problem. This applies directly to your own life. Think about the last time a situation felt genuinely overwhelming. Not difficult. Overwhelming. The kind of situation where your mind was running in several directions at once and none of the directions felt like they were leading anywhere useful. If you had stopped in that moment and asked yourself what you actually knew for certain versus what you were projecting forward in fear, you would have found that the confirmed problem was significantly more manageable than the version your brain had assembled under stress. This is not a soft reframe. This is a precise cognitive operation that reduces the load on your working memory by eliminating data that has no business being in your decision-making process in the first place. Before we go further, pause for a second. Have you ever been in a situation where your thinking completely locked up under pressure and you had no idea why? Drop in the comments. I was thinking harder but going nowhere. That phrase describes a cognitive state that more people experience than anyone talks about. You are not alone in it, and by the end of this video, you will understand exactly what was happening and what to do differently. The second layer of the NASA cognitive architecture involves something that engineers refer to as decision hierarchy under uncertainty. This is where the thinking becomes genuinely sophisticated. In a high-pressure scenario with incomplete information, the untrained mind tries to solve the wrong problem first. It attacks whatever feels most urgent emotionally, which is usually not the same as what is most structurally critical. The trained mind operates from a completely different sequence. It asks, what is the decision that, if made incorrectly right now, cannot be reversed? That question immediately reorganizes the entire cognitive landscape. Irreversible decisions rise to the top of the priority stack. Reversible decisions get temporarily suspended, and suddenly there is clarity about where to place cognitive energy first. Think about the Apollo 13 mission. When the oxygen tank ruptured in 1970, the flight controllers in Houston were not faced with a single problem. They were facing dozens of simultaneous variables, any one of which could have been fatal. The cognitive trap in that moment would have been to try to address everything at once, which would have addressed nothing effectively. Instead, the team operated from a strict decision hierarchy. The first question was not how do we fix this? The first question was what decision made incorrectly in the next few minutes ends this permanently? Everything else was suspended until that answer was clear. The result is history. Not because those engineers were exceptional human beings in some mystical sense, but because they were applying a cognitive framework that most people never learn to use. The practical translation of this into your daily life is more powerful than it might initially appear. Every time you feel overwhelmed by a complex situation with multiple moving parts, you are almost certainly making the same error, treating everything as equally urgent because everything feels urgent simultaneously. The feeling of urgency is not the same as actual structural priority. Training your mind to ask which decisions are irreversible and attending to those first is one of the highest leverage cognitive upgrades available to any person operating in a complex environment. It does not require more information. It does not require more time. It requires a different first question. There is a third element to this system that operates underneath the surface and almost nobody talks about. It has to do with how NASA engineers manage their internal narrative during a crisis. Under extreme pressure, the human brain begins to generate explanatory stories about what is happening and why. This is a natural function of the mind. It is how the brain creates meaning and establishes causal frameworks. But under pressure, these stories form too quickly with too little information, and they harden into assumptions that then shape every subsequent decision. The brain commits to a narrative and then filters all incoming data through that narrative rather than updating the narrative based on incoming data. Researchers call this premature closure. Engineers call it tunnel vision. Whatever the name, the effect is the same. The mind stops seeing the problem as it is and starts seeing a projection of what it expects the problem to be. The specific training designed to counter this is called assumption auditing, and it works in a way that is almost surgical. At regular intervals during a complex problem, the trained mind stops and asks, what am I assuming right now that I have not verified? Not in a vague philosophical sense, precisely. What specific assumption is currently driving my decision-making that I have not confirmed with actual data? This question forces the brain to surface its own hidden framework and hold it up to examination. More often than not, at least one central assumption turns out to be either unverified or outright wrong. And correcting that assumption earlier rather than later is frequently the difference between a solution and a spiral. This is exactly what happens when people spend hours working on a problem and then discover that the fundamental premise they were working from was never confirmed in the first place. The hours were not wasted because of a lack of intelligence or effort. They were wasted because the brain committed to a narrative before it had enough information to justify that commitment. Assumption auditing is the cognitive habit that prevents this. It is not complicated to learn, it is simply not taught, because the systems that educate most people were not designed to produce this level of mental precision. Now, here is where the system becomes genuinely elite. The engineers who operate at the highest level of performance under pressure have developed what could be described as a dual-channel processing mode. This means they have trained themselves to maintain two simultaneous cognitive tracks during high-stakes work. The first track is operational. It is managing the immediate task, the current decision, the real-time data coming in. The second track is observational. It is watching the first track from a slight distance, monitoring for signs of cognitive overload, premature closure, or emotional contamination of the decision-making process. Most people only operate on one track. When something goes wrong, they are entirely inside the problem, with no part of their mind standing outside it watching how they are thinking. The engineers who perform best under pressure have learned to keep that second track running continuously, which means they can catch their own cognitive errors in real time rather than discovering them after the damage is done. Developing this capacity in yourself is not a mystical practice. It begins with a simple habit. At any point during complex thinking, ask yourself not only what you are thinking, but how you are thinking. Are you in a reactive mode or a structured mode? Is your reasoning being driven by data or by anxiety? Is your attention scattered across the whole problem or focused on the critical path? These questions, practiced regularly during lower stakes situations, gradually build the neural pathways required to maintain that second track even when the pressure is at its highest. The brain is plastic. The architecture can be built, but it has to be built deliberately during training, not improvised during the crisis. There is one more layer, and this is the part that most people miss even when they understand everything else. When the situation is resolved, whether successfully or not, the untrained mind either celebrates or recovers and then moves on. The trained mind does something that looks inefficient from the outside, but is actually one of the most powerful performance accelerators that exists. It conducts a structured cognitive debrief, not an emotional review, a structural one. What information did I have? What decision did I make with that information? What was the reasoning chain? Where did the reasoning diverge from optimal? What assumption did I hold that should have been questioned earlier? This process converts experience into precise, reusable mental capital. Each situation, regardless of outcome, becomes a calibration event that sharpens the entire cognitive architecture for the next encounter with pressure. This is why experienced engineers in high-stakes environments do not simply become more experienced with time, they become structurally different thinkers. The volume of situations they have processed through structured debrief has refined their pattern recognition, reduced their assumption errors, and trained their decision hierarchies to activate faster and with greater accuracy. They are not working harder than their peers. They are working with a more refined instrument. If you have made it this far, you are already in a different category from the person who clicked away in the first minute. The ideas in this video are not motivational content. They are the actual cognitive architecture that separates people who think clearly under pressure from people who only think clearly in its absence. And the truth that most stop short of understanding is this architecture does not fully activate until it is applied under real conditions. Reading about it builds awareness. Practice builds capacity. The next step is to put these tools into your actual thinking process during situations that feel uncomfortable and complex. Start with assumption auditing. Identify one situation this week where you will deliberately stop and ask what you are assuming that you have not verified. That single move, applied consistently, changes the entire quality of your decision-making over time. If this way of thinking connects with how you want to operate, subscribe. This channel is built for people who want to understand the systems behind elite cognitive performance, not the inspiration around it. There is a video coming that takes this even deeper, specifically into how expert decision makers structure their attention during the first 60 seconds of a high-stakes situation. That first minute contains more leverage than most people realize, and the architecture behind it is something almost nobody discusses. You will want to see it.